No, sir. Go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir. He was sounding the deeps of his nature, and of the parts of his nature that were deeper than he, going back into the womb of time. A man with a club, bat, is a lawmaker, a man to be obeyed, but not necessarily conciliated. The ghostly winter silence had given way to the great spring murmur of awakening life. And at the instant he knew, he ceased to know. This expression of abandon and surrender, of absolute trust, he reserved for the master alone. Limited minds can recognize limitations only in others. He was a man without a past, whose future was the imminent grave and whose present was a bitter fever of living. Man rarely places a proper valuation upon his womankind, at least not until deprived of them. The function of man is to live, not to exist. My mistake was in ever opening the books, so that was the way. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. They were not half living, or quarter living. They were simply so many bags of bones in which sparks of life fluttered faintly. Every book was a peephole into the realm of knowledge. His hunger fed upon what he read, and increased. I do not live for what the world thinks of me, but for what I think of myself. The more he studied, the more vistas he caught of fields of knowledge yet unexplored, and the regret that days were only 24 hours long became a chronic complaint with him. It was the worst hurt he had ever known. He had been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. Of her own experience she had no memory of the thing happening, but in her instinct, which was the experience of all mothers of wolves, there lurked a memory of fathers that had eaten their newborn and helpless progeny. More you drink, want. It was the masterful and incommunicable wisdom of eternity laughing at the futility of life and the effort of life. It was the wild, the savage, frozen-hearted Northland wild. Ch1. You stand on dead men's legs. You've never had any of your own. You couldn't walk alone between two sunrises and hustle the meat for your belly. I was jealous, therefore I loved. The proper function of man is to live, not to exist. Food and fire, protection and companionship, were some of the things he received from the god. In return, he guarded the god's property, defended his body, worked for him, and obeyed him. But the wild is the wild, and motherhood is motherhood, at all times fiercely protective whether in the wild or out of it. He had killed man, the noblest game of all, and he had killed in the face of the law of club and fawn. Is love so gross a thing that it must fashion and public notice? It would seem so. The press of the United States? It is a parasitic growth that battens on the capitalist class. Its function is to serve the established by molding public opinion, and right well it serves it. Pray do not interrupt me, he wrote. I am smiling. Bog lights, vapors of mysticism, psychic gnosticisms, veils and tissues of words, gibbering subjectivisms, gropings and maunderings, ontological fantasies, panpsychic hallucinations, this is the stuff, the phantasms of hope, that fills your bookshelves. Come. Your glass is empty. Fill and forget. For the pride of trace and trail was his, and sick unto death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, the old tricks which they had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. And when, on the still cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead in dust, pointing nose at star and howling down through the centuries and through him. It was an old song, old as the breed itself, one of the first songs of the younger world in a day when songs were sad. It was invested with the woe of unnumbered generations, this plaint by which Buck was so strangely stirred. When he moaned and sobbed, it was with the pain of living that was of old the pain of his wild fathers, and the fear any mystery of the cold and dark that was to them fear and mystery. And that he marked the completeness with which he harked back through the ages of fire and roof to the raw beginnings of life in the howling ages. Nietzsche was right. I won't take the time to tell you who Nietzsche was, but he was right. The world belongs to the strong who are noble as well and who do not wallow in the swine trough of trade and exchange. The world belongs to the true noblemen, to the great blonde beasts, to the non-compromisers, to the yes-sayers. You can't wait for inspiration. You have to go after it with a club. I know nothing that I may say can influence you, he said. You have no souls to be influenced. You are spineless, flaccid things. You pompously call yourselves Republicans and Democrats. There is no Republican Party. There is no Democratic Party. There are no Republicans nor Democrats in this house. You are lick-spittlers and panderers, the creatures of the plutocracy. But under it all they were men, penetrating the land of desolation and mockery and silence, puny adventurers bent on colossal adventure, pitting themselves against the might of a world as remote and alien and pulseless as the abysses of space. In his gambling, he had one besetting weakness: faith in a system, and this made his damnation certain. Martin heaved a sigh of relief when the door closed behind the laundryman. He was becoming antisocial. Daily he found it a severer strain to be decent with people. Their presence perturbed him, and the effort of conversation irritated him. They made him restless, and no sooner was he in contact with them than he was casting about for excuses to get rid of them. He was justifying his existence, than which life can do no greater, for life achieves its summit when it does to the uttermost that which it was equipped to do. Thus it was that in obedience to the law laid down by his mother, and in obedience to the law of that unknown and nameless thing, fear from the mouth of the cave, his bondage had softened him. Irresponsibility had weakened him. He had forgotten how to shift for himself. The night yawned about him. There was nothing the matter with them except they were dead tired. It was not the dead tiredness that comes through brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours, but it was the dead tiredness that comes through the slow and prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. But I am I, and I won't subordinate my taste to the unanimous judgment of mankind. If I don't like a thing, I don't like it, that's all, and there is no reason under the sun why I should ape a liking for it just because the majority of my fellow creatures like it, or make believe they like it. I can't follow the fashions in the things I like or dislike. Always has woman crouched close to earth like a partridge hen mothering her young. Always has my wantonness of roving led me out on the shining ways, and always have my star paths returned me to her, the figure everlasting, the woman, the one woman, for whose arms I had such need that clasped in them I have forgotten the stars. For her I accomplished odysseys, scaled mountains, crossed deserts, for her I led the hunt battle, and for her and to her I sang my songs of the things I had done. All ecstasies of life and rhapsodies of delight have been mine because of her. And here, at the end, I can say that I have known no sweeter, deeper madness of being than to drown in the fragrant glory and forgetfulness of her hair. Had the cub thought in man fashion, he might have epitomized life as a voracious appetite, and the world as a place wherein ranged a multitude of appetites, pursuing and being pursued, hunting and being hunted, eating and being eaten, all in blindness and confusion, with violence and disorder, a chaos of gluttony and slaughter, ruled over by chance, merciless, planless, endless. He was always striving to attain it. The life that was so swiftly expanding within him urged him continually toward the wall of light. The life that was within him knew that it was the one way out, the way he was predestined to tread. His muscles had wasted away to knotty strings, and the force appeared, so that each rib and every bone in his frame were outlined cleanly through the loose hide that was wrinkled in folds of emptiness. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. On the sled, in the box, lay a third man whose toil was over, a man whom the wild had conquered and beaten down until he would never move nor struggle again. It is not the way of the wild to like movement. Life is an offense to it, for life is movement, and the wild aims always to destroy movement. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. Let beauty be your end. Why should you mint beauty into gold? Anyway, you can't. The fortunate man is the one who cannot take more than a couple of drinks without becoming intoxicated. The unfortunate wight is the one who can take many glasses without betraying a sign, who must take numerous glasses in order. He was a ferocious man. He had been ill-made in the making. He had not been born right, and he had not been helped any by the molding he had received at the hands of society. The hands of society are harsh, and this man was a striking sample of its handiwork. He was a beast, a human beast, it is true, but nevertheless so terrible a beast that he can best be characterized as carnivorous. Out of this pack persecution he learned two important things: how to take care of himself in a mass fight against him, and how, on a single dog, to inflict the greatest amount of damage in the briefest space of time. Denied the outlet, through play, of his energies, he recoiled upon himself and developed his mental processes. He became cunning. He had idle time in which to devote himself to thoughts of trickery. At once he became an enigma. One side or the other of his nature was perfectly comprehensible, but both sides together were bewildering. Easier to see brave men die than to hear a coward beg for life. Class supremacy can rest only on class degradation. The human race is doomed to sink back farther and farther into the primitive night ere again it begins its bloody climb upward to civilization. In dim ways he recognized in man the animal that had fought itself to primacy over the other animals of the wild. Not alone out of his own eyes, but out of the eyes of all his ancestors was the cub now looking upon man. They were fire makers. They were gods. Humans. They were his environment, these men, and they were molding the clay of him into a more ferocious thing than had been intended by nature. Nevertheless, nature had given him plasticity. Where many another animal would have died or had its spirit broken, he adjusted himself and lived, and at no expense of the spirit. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things, and not in life that did not yearn toward life was in fair way toward ceasing. There is a patience of the wild, dogged, tireless, persistent as life itself. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy, impermanent planet. The proper function of a man is to live, not to exist. Jack London. No man can be intellectually insulted. Insult, in its very nature, is emotional. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. Woe of unnumbered generations. There is such a thing as anesthesia of pain, engendered by pain too exquisite to be borne. But there were other forces at work in the cub, the greatest of which was growth. Instinct and law demanded of him obedience. But growth demanded disobedience. In the end, one day, fear and obedience were swept away by the rush of life, and the cub straddled and sprints. Wakens the ferine strain. Having no new companions, nothing remained for him but to read. I'll have you know I do the swearing on this ship. If I need your assistance, I'll call you. Captain Wolf Larsen. Life streamed through him in splendid flood, glad and rampant, until it seemed that it would burst him asunder in sheer ecstasy and pour forth generously over the world.